This is a storyboard. Before Parasite was shot, director Bong Joon-ho turned his written script into a series of drawn images that are then used to guide and inspire the movie's visuals. Not every director and every film uses storyboards, but pretty much every film follows this approach. Text and supplementary visual material are used to guide the production, and it's only in production and afterwards in post-production that sound design is brought in as a creative element in the filmmaking process. It's the tradition for sound to follow, not to lead, is how Oscar-winning sound designer Randy Thom described this status quo. He says, "That's strange because we also know that sounds are evocative. Sounds suggest images at least as much as images suggest sound." So what if we flipped this status quo on its head? What you're hearing now is the sonic storyboard for the 2019 film The Souvenir. This storyboard was created for director Joanna Hogg by sound designer Jonathan Webb. As we listen, we hear a montage of sounds that establish a sense of place, atmosphere, and mood. We hear television and radio programs, as well as music and the sound of a table being set, evoking domestic warmth and a sense of nostalgia and almost innocence. But if we listen to this roughly 45-minute audio piece in real time, what we experience through this collection of sounds is a descent from that nostalgic innocence into an atmosphere of tension and confusion, which captures the emotional arc of the story. I've always loved the process of filmmaking just as much as movies themselves, and I'm especially interested in filmmakers who approach this process in new and inventive ways. This concept of bringing in sound design earlier in the pre-production process could be used and applied to many different movies in a variety of ways. Several filmmakers and sound designers have explored and advocated for this idea over the years. Most recently, I know of this kind of thing being done for Denis Villeneuve's Dune. I'll get more into those other possibilities later, but first, I want to detail how Jonathan and Joanna explored a fresh approach to filmmaking during the making of what just so happens to be one of my favorite movies of the last decade.
Do you want to go from...
The Souvenir is a beautiful film, which I won't spoil here, but I want to give you enough of an overview so that you have the context to appreciate what went into making it. Part 1 follows Julie, a young woman living in the 80s as she navigates film school and a troubling relationship with a mysterious older man, Anthony. Part 2 shows her processing this relationship as she makes a film about it.
You can really tell that they had chemistry.
Much of the beauty of the film to me is how it unfolds very gently from Julie's limited perspective. Nothing is laid out explicitly for the audience. There's a kind of impressionistic quality to the way the plot unfolds that I love. For example, most movies that center on a relationship don't depict the meeting of the two characters in the relationship like this. In a moment like this, the director is usually signaling somehow to the audience that this moment is significant, that these two characters meeting is going to play a significant role in the story. Instead, we get here an incredible naturalism that kind of mirrors how we experience these things in real life.
Which I found really, really interesting.
This example also shows how Joanna is prioritizing sound in her storytelling. We hear Anthony's voice before we see his face.
So that's why we thought this would work out.
The same is true of Julie, the main character.
Yes, it's about a 16-year-old boy called Tony.
The character of Julie is loosely based on writer and director Joanna Hogg herself, and the relationship that Julie has in part 1 is loosely based on a real relationship from Joanna's life. And then in part 2, we see Julie adapting her real life into a film. There's a directness to this where it almost feels like we're watching Joanna process what it's like to make this film as she makes the film through the character of Julie. It's a great exploration of the process of creating art, relationships, and loss of innocence that feels deeply grounded, naturalistic, and personal throughout. So I wasn't surprised to learn that the process of creating it involves some unique approaches to filmmaking. When Jonathan and Joanna first spoke, he had already made a few experimental soundscape mood board pieces for novels that he had read.
There's a kind of cinematic landscape that's playing out as you're reading, and could I do something that kept you in that kind of moment through sound?
Joanna had heard these pieces and thought it might be helpful to have Jonathan create something similar for an autobiographical short story she had written, which she was planning on turning into a film.
You know, a sort of collage of sounds that I'm thinking of around the film itself, and sort of in a way becomes a storyboard in sound, in a sense.
She writes what's like a kind of mini novella, and she sent me the story and just said, look, you know, just do what you like. Here's this thing, now make something that sounds like it.
For Joanna and Jonathan, the goal here wasn't necessarily to create something that would be a guide for the film's final sound design, in the same way a visual storyboard is a guide specifically for the cinematography.
You know, not that one's then pursuing those exact sounds in the finished film, because I think there's always a danger. It's so easy, isn't it, to get attached to something.
It's more about trying to encourage visuals as well as sound in the mind of the director, sort of stimulating his or her imagination with sound.
What Jonathan ended up creating were essentially these two roughly 45-minute audio montages that created an immersive soundscape for the stories.
The story is about a boy aged 16 who's in his last term of a comprehensive school in Sunderland and obviously about to face the prospect of finding a job.
It's essentially a part of film pre-production research. As a story kind of progresses from page to screen, you're providing the director with a different perspective, a new angle to look at the story through sound, offering them details about the fictional space, characterization, the kind of environmental and cultural conditions that are, you know, at play within the narrative from, you know, essentially a sonic perspective. For me, I assemble a range of audio materials, music, field recordings, archival recordings, sound effects, and I bring all those together to make an audio interpretation of the full story. It's a translation of a story on its way to becoming a film.
And what's incredible to me listening to what Jonathan created is that while you don't pick up on many of the explicit details of the plot and the characters, you do get a really strong sense of where they are and the tone and mood of the story. And you even feel the emotional arc of the story for the characters as the storyboard progresses.
You are a traitor.
Jonathan is crafting something that specifically feels cinematic as well, drawing inspiration from evocative, subjective uses of sound in films like Todd Haynes' Carol, and even Joanna Hogg's previous work like Exhibition. Another thing that makes this project unique is some of the material that Jonathan had available to pull from.
And luckily for me, she carried around with her a tape recorder between 1980 and 1985. So she had this massive personal archive of recordings. And so she had tapes with just her leaving a recorder on by accident in a room in her apartment and walking out. And just the perfect room tone from 1980.
So when we hear a recording of Joanna having a conversation with a parapsychologist in the storyboard,
and I think the ideas are there and they can be brought to fruition. My suggestion is this.
Those are actual recorded conversations from that time in Joanna's life. And these get adapted into the scenes where Julie sees a parapsychologist in part 2.
That he didn't know how to go forward with life in this deception that had become his life. I would wager that you two had more disagreements than you had had for the period of time.
A little Easter egg unrelated to the sound is that the woman who plays the parapsychologist here is the same woman Joanna actually saw in her real life 30 years prior. And Jonathan was invited onto the set of the production of part 1, where he recorded audio that made it into the sonic storyboard for part 2,
Can we have some house lights, please?
which then went on to influence the production of part 2, which depicts a sort of fictionalized version of the production of part 1. This blurring of reality and fiction in the sonic storyboards, I think, is more than just a neat piece of trivia about the behind the scenes of the film. It feels intimately tied to what the story is about.
So the material is real, those people exist, but I am designing new ones. to fit what I want to make.
Julie in the film is blurring reality and fiction in the stories that she's telling on screen, which is what Joanna is doing in the story that she's telling on screen. For example, when Julie looks at photos that she's taken in the movie, we're looking at photos that are from Joanna's own personal archive. To me, this is most clearly represented when Julie watches her own movie in part 2. When Julie watches The Souvenir, she doesn't see the movie that she's been making throughout the film. The actors that we've seen her filming are replaced with herself and the character of Anthony. It's like she enters this bizarre, surreal space where she can no longer separate her own art from her own memory. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the sonic storyboards that Jonathan made are literally that. Sometimes we're hearing actual recordings from Joanna's past, recordings from the production of part 1, Jonathan's surreal sound design, and archival clips from other movies all being mixed together.
I told you what this show means to me. Well, this is what it does mean. Hello. Hello, Murphy.
That's the process of creating art. That's what's happening when we create something. We end up mixing all these different influences together and pushing out something new, whether we are conscious of it or not. But again, the goal here wasn't to create something for public consumption. And so while Jonathan's work is a piece of art in its own right, I'm interested in how this work fit into the larger process of creating The Souvenir.
Because, when something's so close to you and that you've experienced, it's very hard to see it, or, it's a different understanding of it. So it's just turning it into another form so it can be just seen from another angle.
I know for myself personally, sound engages part of my imagination that looking at visuals doesn't.
You were helping to encapsulate some of the mood of the story, of the real story, which then inspired the fictional story.
There's something about hearing but not seeing that I think provokes you to try to imagine visuals that fit with the sounds. You can imagine for Joanna, as she's going through the process of expanding this story for the screen, that being able to listen to a specific soundscape that evokes the time, place, and personal history that this story is about would be provocative and inspiring. It's not that sound is better than visuals for these purposes, but it does offer something that visuals don't.
It's quite ambiguous sound at times. You participate in the engagement between, the way the sound's projected at you and how you receive it. The Souvenir is about this, what's real, what's actually fiction, and sound sort of fit beautifully in that space when I sort of combined Joanna's authentic, untreated recordings from that period in her life with my reconstructions of what London hubbub was, London Underground or something was like in that period. When you layer the two over each other, even Joanna was sort of unsure about what did she actually experience in those moments. And I think, that says a lot about sound's ability to conjure experiences in a way that maybe visuals don't.
Even though the explicit goal of the sonic storyboards wasn't to influence the sound of the final film, there are definitely some similarities between the two, particularly in how Julie's student film was portrayed and in the treatment of the film's reoccurring sound motif. It seems to me like Jonathan's work had at least some minor influence on how Joanna Hogg and the supervising sound editor Yvonne Ader approached the film's sound design, and some of Jonathan's musical selections even ended up in the final film. I think it's impossible from my perspective to untangle how much of an influence Jonathan's storyboards really had on the final film. Obviously, we can't know what the movie would have looked like had he not been involved, but it sounds like it offered Joanna a valuable perspective based on what she says.
What excited me is that it would just be part of the process of discovery. I like the fact that it felt like a new form.
So it seems like the sonic storyboard process was valuable for this project, the themes it was exploring, and how Joanna wanted to work. But would this way of working, of involving sound design much earlier in the process, apply to other films?
Sound design usually is something that happens after the edit is done, the visual effects are done, often the score is even done, and we don't have any input into how all of that happened. Denis does this a very different way.
Denis Villeneuve is another director who has been experimenting with this a little bit. Earlier this year, I spoke with Mark Mangini, Oscar-winning sound designer who's worked on Dune and Blade Runner 2049, and he talked about how Denis had them do sound design for The Worm before certain visual effects were made.
Tradition has been you conceptualize a shot. The worm's gonna breach the desert here, and it's gonna travel over here, and then it's gonna go dig back into the sand there, and we'll wait 6 months for that shot. And we don't do any work on that until we finally see some mock-up of the worm do this action. Well, Denis and Joe recognize that sometimes the sound itself, if we build it before the shot is realized, can inform the way the graphic artists actually animate what we're going to see on screen. And we did that a great deal in Dune.
And this approach of not using sound as a source of inspiration, but actually letting the sound lead the charge, is the approach that Randy Thom has been advocating for decades. Many directors and writers even already use sound in the form of music to guide the creative process. I know many directors and writers, myself included, who write to music, and I know a lot of screenwriters who will put together a playlist of music to go with a screenplay, not with the intention of that music making it into the final film, but just sort of as a soundtrack and atmospheric extension of the screenplay itself. So what if, instead of limiting that to music, you designed soundscapes throughout the pre-production and development process of a film? What if when a writer was stuck on a script, or when the script was finished but before the concept art was made, a sound designer was brought on to begin working on soundscapes for the film? These soundscapes or sonic storyboards could influence rewrites, influence how the visuals of the film are crafted, and I can even imagine some actors finding this helpful in discovering and immersing themselves into a character. All this sounds great, but there are certainly barriers to working this way. Sound is often one of the last considerations on a film. In many ways, if you want to do this, you're battling against an industry that already cuts corners even when it comes to dialogue recording during production.
Well, I heard Randy say, or maybe he wrote somewhere, that one of the barriers to this way of working is the industrial imperative of the movies.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. But both of us were unsure about what the potential for this was, and even if it would work. But that is what being a filmmaker or an artist is.
What I love so much about this innovation in filmmaking is that it isn't the result of some technological innovation. Jonathan and Joanna didn't decide to do this because some new technology made it easier to do this. They pushed forward an approach that's been barely explored simply because they were willing to try something that wasn't the status quo. Joanna was willing to pitch it to Jonathan and give it a shot just for the sake of trying it, not knowing if it was going to work. And this is what's required to continue evolving an art form. Sometimes it's easy to feel like filmmaking and movies have gotten a little stale, but I think this comes from audiences and filmmakers putting what a movie looks like and how it's made inside a box. But that box is often defined more by just how it's always been done than it is by what's actually best or most artistically compelling. When it comes to filmmaking or any creative work, we often have much more freedom in how we approach the work than we really give ourselves. But we constrain ourselves unnecessarily because exercising that creative freedom involves taking risks. Risk is at odds with the profit motive, but that risk is where any potential artistic innovation lies. It's the holidays coming up, which means a lot of people are traveling. And I recently learned that if you're booking your travel from within the United States, you're often charged more than if you're booking from other locations. NordVPN, the sponsor for this video, is one way that you can get around this and save some money. They did research and discovered that by booking hotels and car rentals outside the United States, you can sometimes save a pretty significant amount of money. A VPN or a virtual private network allows you to change the location of where you're browsing from. So if you're in the United States, you can set your VPN to Mexico, and it looks like you're located in Mexico to any of the websites that you're visiting. This comes in useful if you want to save money on travel. It also comes in useful if you're traveling and you want access to the same streaming content that you normally watch. If you've ever been hit with that "this content is not available in your region" message, you know it can be incredibly frustrating. NordVPN is the solution to that. Changing your location to get access to content or save money isn't the only thing that VPNs are good for. They also help protect your privacy by shielding your web traffic from your internet service provider. And NordVPN comes with a bunch of other tools that help protect you from malware and other threats to your internet security. A VPN is one of those basic internet tools that I think every internet user should have at their disposal, and NordVPN makes an incredibly easy to use, fast VPN that you can use on all your devices. When you go to nordvpn.com/tflight, clicking my link in the description, you'll get 4 bonus months for free when you sign up for the 2-year plan. NordVPN is incredibly affordable, easy to use. It's going to give you access to the content that you love, save you money when you're booking on travel, and help protect you as you're browsing the web. Go to nordvpn.com/tflight to sign up for that 2-year plan, and you'll get those bonus 4 months for free for using my code. Click the link in the description below or on the screen. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video.